And I went. And when they did the next season, the ratings dropped because the show lost the edge, it lost a lot of the humor, it lost the personality, the character. And about halfway through the season, they called me and they said, "We're in trouble. The ratings are falling. Will you come back to the show?" And I said, "Can I run a truck over the Junior Ghostbusters?" "No, you can't run a truck over them, but if you don't want to write them, you don't have to." "Good. I will come back on the condition that I can write the show the way that I want to write it, the way that it should have been written in the first place, and I restore Janine to the character that she was." And they said yes. When I was working on the show, I always watched it being broadcast because sometimes things would happen, things would drop out, and it's important to follow the process through from first page to last frame. When I left the show, those shows that were done without my participation, I didn't watch. It was too painful to see the show being that thoroughly decimated. In the original movie, Slimer was there as a character, but just various bits and pieces of him were there. When we did the series, there's this thing about cartoon shows for kids where they feel it has to have a mascot of some kind. Usually it's a dog. And they felt that Slimer could fill that role of being a mascot. It didn't make a whole lot of sense, but my job was to make it make sense and make him sort of a part of the group, which is why we had Citizen Ghost that told the story of how he ended up being part and parcel of our gang. My theory on Slimer was that a little Slimer goes a long way, and you use him to pepper things and to sort of be there as an instrument of chaos and randomness. Develop his character a little bit, but don't go too far with it, because when you come down end of the day, he's a large green blob, and our characters are our characters. So I try to always say, use him minimally to good effect, not maximally no effect. Joe's theory of writing is that if everything is funny, nothing is funny. If everything is scary, nothing is scary. If the show is all Slimer, it's nothing. So in that season where I was involved with story editing the show, I brought him up a little bit as flavoring, not as the entire entree. I think what happened in the subsequent series demonstrates the point rather well, because when they brought Slimer to the foreground and made it Slimer and the real Ghostbusters, the ratings dropped and the attention dropped. And they were there to see the real Ghostbusters based on the movie. The movie wasn't called Slimer. And I think by putting him in front of it, it lost a lot of the adult audience that had shown up for the original series. The series appealed to not just kids, but to grown-ups. We wrote it on two levels. If you were just a kid and didn't know anything about anything else, you could appreciate the show on one level. If you're an adult, there's this whole other level that reveals itself to you. And to make adults show up to see that, you have to tell them, no, this is actually a pretty cool show. Adults aren't going to show up for a show called Slimer. And consequently, they stopped watching. The show went down, and they realized that putting Slimer in front of the nature of the show, being the real Ghostbusters, did not work. I liked writing Egon, of all the characters, probably the most, Ray being second, because his personality is most like my own. He lives too much in his own head. He's too far from his own emotions, and he's naive, but in a way that says, I believe in what I'm doing. There's this real charm about the character by virtue of what he doesn't do and what he can't do. He's afraid to touch emotion, and that makes him appealing. So for me, as a person writing the character, I responded to Egon the most, probably as being the most like myself. Peter Venkman was probably the hardest character to write because he was the comedic voice. He had to make the jokes. And to really make that character funny is hard. There's also, as I understood him at least, there's a sort of an anger inside of Peter. There's something that's not connecting inside of him. He has issues. Issues is a 5-volume set with woodcuts and an introduction. And he's a cynic. And to me, that was important to bring out. In the Christmas episode and others, he's the one who doesn't go for the okie doke. Ray and Egon are happy to believe in the goodness of mankind. Peter, he's a little more reserved. He's waiting for someone to disappoint him. And that made him a challenge to make that funny, to make depression funny. So it was a real challenge. Of all the characters that were there, he was the hardest one for me to write. And that made the most fun though, because you want a challenge as a writer. You want to be able to sort of say, how far can I push this? And keep this character laconic, annoyed, depressed, cynical, but lovable. That's the hard part. Ray was always the easiest one to write of all the characters, because Ray was the most enthusiastic of the characters. He was the one who was most open and gregarious and happy. Ray was a sloppy, floppy puppy with a ball. And that made him very easy to write for. He believes things very easily. He's very earnest. And being really earnest and really honest can be very, very funny. So for me, he's the most lovable character on the show, because he's just an average guy. He's just this guy who happens to have a gift of making things. And I just enjoy writing him as the default. If things weren't working out with Egon, if I couldn't make up the math work or whatever he was working on, if I couldn't find a really funny line for Peter, I would go right to Ray to say something really earnest or sincere. Winston, to me, is in some ways the heart that keeps the whole thing together. He is the most grounded of all the characters, because he doesn't get his head up in the clouds. He's not cynical or depressed. He's not, a happy-go-lucky guy in terms of how far Ray goes off into the ether. He was the one you could always go to for a realistic point of view. If they're in serious trouble, he's going to be the one to say, "Here, so I'm going to die." And you want that grounding there, particularly in a show which deals with the fantastic. The more fantastic you want to go, the more you have to have a certain level of reality there to pin the audience to accept the larger story, accept the magical elements of it. And Winston was that character. He was the person who really gave you a strong foundation in the real world, so that you could then go off and explore the larger issues. Janine was a free-floating agent of chaos. She had this great interest in Egon, which we sort of hinted at here and there and played with. She was the one you could always count on to bring down the egos. I mean, you talk about egos on display. Peter and Ray and Egon, and to a lesser degree Winston, could get very pompous sometimes, very full of themselves. And you want a needle to puncture that balloon once in a while. And Janine was that needle. And the fun of it was watching her dealing with things around her that she wasn't really hired to deal with. She was hired to be a secretary. She was hired to answer the phone, not to deal with things that were trying to eat her face. So it was, again, the sense of normality versus the absurd.